if Trump is the king of crypto, Kamala is the queen of crypto, right? She embraced that the crypto space itself very quickly, very soon, and with the financial thing, yes, I think Kamala would have done something very similar to Trump, probably. Under pressure, because she doesn't understand it. First of all, she doesn't understand how it works, so she needs to follow somebody's guidance on interest rates and stuff like that, or monetary policies. She'd have to follow somebody's guidance, and she would do what she's required to do by the financial class. So she would probably lower rates if need be, blah blah blah. In that sense, they are puppets, right? They're just there to repeat certain stories, and they create the illusion that they are fighting each other in a democratic environment, when both, we know very well that this democratic environment is based on a lot of money. They're able to compete because of a lot of money that is involved in their campaigns, etc., etc. So it's democratic to a point. It's democratic only insofar as we accept that you can compete only if you have a lot of money, first of all, right? I mean, really compete. That itself, to me, sets it up as a theater. I mean, any political theater could be a good theater, right? It could be a theater with consequences, with real consequences, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying that being a theater is a bad thing. I'm saying that this to me is controlled theater. It's puppeteering, right? There's some puppet master here, more or less, deciding when one goes in and the other one goes out. Right, so if all of a sudden Trump becomes a problem, they get rid of it. They find a way of replacing it. Right, I'm absolutely certain the assassination maybe was also an attempt to show him.
All right. Well, after a bit of a break, we're back with Fabio Vighi on talking about emergency capitalism, and I'm glad to have him back on to get the show on the road again. And this is the first time we're talking after the election of Donald Trump.
Yes, that's right. Yes, Doug. I think we were meant to have a chat about it, but then didn't happen.
Somehow it didn't happen.
No,
So
yeah.
so it's still a relevant.
Yeah,
still a relevant
sure.
topic,
Oh,
and
yeah.
but it will be for years to come, I think. And
Mm-hmm.
What I have been thinking about is how, for a long time, since around 2008, my understanding of Marxist politics and politics in general has been that it's all coming up in the wake of an economic crisis that could not be solved, that or not that ultimately couldn't be solved by capitalist means. That we were not going to be able to overcome the tendency for the rate of profit to decline. That would and also that we weren't going to be able to have a kind of boom that came after World War II, say, or even
Yeah.
after the recession of the 70s.
Yes.
Again, but now we've elected Trump, and
I see where you're going.
so
Now we are going to boom again. Boom,
we're going to boom. We're going to have another boom.
What sort of explosion we're going to have?
Well, what kind of explosion we're going to have is a question.
Yes.
But so my question for you is, do you think that this feeling, now this is not a feeling that's happening on the left at all, but it is happening, I think, amongst the majority of the population in the United States right now, just barely,
Yeah.
that there is an optimism about the future. There's a feeling that we could again have, we could onshore industry, we could have more jobs, we're going to have, profitability will go up, and, a rising tide will raise all boats. And the United States will again stride across the world as a leader of the free world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Morning in America, um, without a U. Uh, so,
Yeah.
what do you make of all that? I mean, obviously, even if it was a boom, it would be temporary. It would be a way to kick the can
Yeah.
down the road from our perspective. But but even in terms of a temporary upswing, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the word boom should be connected with explosion in destructive terms more than anything, like not
Hmm.
in expanding economic terms. I don't think it's going to happen again. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen just for the usual suspects, for the the 0.1% or something percenters. Those maybe are going to boom and are booming already. If you look at the financial markets after Trump, financial markets are ecstatic, I would say, after the results of the elections. They clearly like Trump. I think Trump was selected, as I said that before, I think, rather than elected. It's Wall Street main candidate. He was always the favorite candidate. For one specific reason, I think, amongst many. He was always the president of zero interest rates. I remember in September 2019, right? Just the time that I consider to be quite crucial because COVID happened just after that, or as a
Hmm.
consequence of September 2019. I think Trump was calling Jay Powell, the Fed head, he was calling him a bonehead for not lowering interest rates as fast as he would want them to be lowered.
Hmm.
And I think at the time it was around 2%, and he wanted obviously less than that. And I think he hinted then, I think it was the beginning of September, even 2019, that he wanted negative interest rates, right? So he's the president of easy money, right, amongst other things, and therefore Wall Street love him because of that. And when he refers to the new golden era, because that's the phrase he's used, right? I mean, this is the new golden era for America, for the United States. I think it's either completely delusional, or he knows very well, opportunistically, that this golden era it's going to happen for the 0.1%. There's not going to be a boom that's going to benefit the whole population. This is just historically and structurally impossible in capitalist terms.
Hmm.
Um, it is really impossible to recreate conditions that are historically dead, that are not going to happen again. It's like ignoring what happened with globalization, for example. Globalization simply meant that production moved to China. Most U.S. factories went to China because already in the late 1970s, early 1980s, in China, they had about 800 million very cheap labor force that were very happy to be exploited to produce cheap goods that then inundated back the US markets. And there was the creation of this deficit cycle because it was all based ultimately on US debt that effectively is what globalization still is to an extent, right? The relationship between productive China and the consumption of the West, and specifically the United States. Um, and I think even the idea of breaking that cycle, however bad it might sound, is extremely traumatic, would be extremely traumatic. Because the United States are now largely unproductive in capitalist terms, and they are highly indebted, of course, as a consequence of that, and they're still counting on the dollar as the dominant global reserve currency to hoover the surpluses, made elsewhere, production surpluses made in Asia, for example, in China and so on, through the dollar dominance and through Wall Street. Those profits are sort of hoovered back into the United States, but they're not produced in the United States any longer. And I think that loop is what constitutes globalization, and the dollar dominance is what allows the United States to still be in a position of dominance, even as a largely unproductive economy.
Well,
So
I just want to. I want.
that cycle is difficult to break. I mean, it's difficult to think that you can break that cycle without paying a very high price, quite literally, in terms of inflation, for example. So, yeah, it's a slogan. It's a slogan that probably works in political terms, and it really makes the financial markets very happy. As we can see, they've broken new records. They've gone even higher after Trump's election. And obviously, the other aspect that I think is crucial for Trump's presidency is the crypto space. The fact that he is considered to be the crypto king, and that is interesting on many levels, economic level, but also in the level of what will happen in a fully digitized economy, and what role do crypto play for a future fully digitized and perhaps centralized rather than decentralized economic order, right? So I think all these pieces are interesting in themselves, but I don't think they point in the direction of a new golden era at all. And I find it structurally impossible to think that there would be one. I'm sorry to be pessimistic, and to have to disappoint you in terms of your optimism, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, I want to point out that my optimism is tempered, and I don't
Yeah.
disagree with a lot of what you said. But I do want to push back a little bit, just see what you say if I raise a couple of points. One is that
Sure.
the United States is the second largest manufacturing country in the world, still, and I recently read a book called "Trade Wars Are Class Wars,"
Mm.
and one of the um, points of the book was that when we think about competition between countries, what we are forgetting is the cooperation between
Mm.
countries. And when you think about a good being manufactured today, it's being manufactured through a process of not just international manufacturing and production, but also of law. And and the main point was that you will see companies that are really international corporations um, decide where they're going to do what part of the production process based on the legal framework in different countries. So you'll have um, some aspect of, let's say, software development happening in the Nordic countries, for instance, and you'll have manufacturing happening somewhere else. And you're talking about an international commodity produced by workers around the world, and but the seeming competition between the countries is also a form of cooperation, um, and so it would seem to me that changing the legal framework, changing the incentives a bit, might take that process and redirect some of the manufacturing back through the United States at some point in the chain of production. So you could end up creating more jobs in the United States with a, a tweak, like something like tariffs, say, which would um, which would redirect some of the flow of material and work back into the United States. So um, the other thing I would raise is just that in an interview with Joe Rogan, um, Trump compared himself to McKinley, the tariff king, right? the who McKinley, who wanted to who succeeded in protecting manufacturing and factory workers both with tariffs and with holding on to the Gold Standard Act. Um, and there was in the 20s, in the 20th century, there was a lot of economic growth for a time. Of course, it led up to the Great Depression. We shouldn't, you know, oversell this idea, right? But the it seems to me that it's possible, um, given what I know, for some of the for this competition and cooperation to work out in such a way that the United States, as the second largest manufacturer in the world, could even become competitive with China on that front for a little while. Uh, what do you think about that?
Well, in abstract terms, if we fail to historicize the problem, put it into
Mm-hmm.
a historical context, to
Mm-hmm.
put labor in a historical context, in fact,
Mm-hmm.
mass labor in historical context, then yes, in abstract terms, it could work. But the trajectory of mass labor as a productive labor has
Mm-hmm.
changed so much in the 20th century, mainly because of the industrial revolutions, the third and the fourth industrial revolution that we're now seeing, that labor is no longer the main source of what we can call valorization in capitalist terms, because the mass of labor necessary to produce commodities is decreasing very rapidly. We have a phenomenon called technological productivity, right? It's productivity that depends less and less on labor, more and more machines. And this is the driving phenomenon of our time. And this is what has actually created the debt that we are in at the moment, whether it's the United States, massive debt, of course, 35 plus trillion, with 100, with about a trillion every 90 days, growing in that respect, expanding the debt. This is a consequence of the inability of capital to create value in using its traditional formula through labor power. And we shouldn't for a second forget about this logic, right? This dynamic. It's really still crucial to anything that happens out there, even relationship of cooperation with China. China itself is increasingly dependent on the financialization model, which sees its central bank having to inject huge amounts of money to revive the economy, to boost the economy, because its engine is suddenly no longer working, right? So China is actually coming to us. We're coming closer and closer. China is coming closer and closer to us in terms of its model of reproduction, which means it's going to be more and more debt-based and hyper-financialized, right? So it's within this context that we need to, I think, place any form of cooperation, economic cooperation. And in that respect, I'm not optimistic. If there is cooperation, it's going to be cooperation towards a more globalized but centralized system of control, rather than a system of crisis management, of almost eternal crisis management that won't go away. Crisis won't go away precisely because the basis of value is melting like snow under the sun. It's melting away. Unfortunately, we could say, right? Because if we believe still in the working class as a protagonist of our work societies, then we have to take into consideration the simple fact that this type of subjectivity is actually melting away because of immanent conditions within the system. The fact that if competition requires you to use machines instead of labor as an individual capital, right? It requires you to eliminate labor, to phase out labor and replace it with intelligent machines or productive technological productivity if you want to compete for market shares, right? And this is a condition that is universal. Like every capital has to engage with this, and overall, that means that the basis for capitalist valorization decreases, and hence that's why we have this massive expansion of financial capital, speculative capital, as a compensative mechanism for this lack of real valorization. So to me, this is the crucial context. If we don't place the new golden era or whatever
Mm-hmm.
into that context, we cannot understand what that means. And I think it can only mean it's either delusional, as I said, to think that there could be one, or it is purely opportunistic in political terms. It's a slogan that sells a certain idea to the people who want to believe it, I think it's going to backfire pretty soon. I think personally, it's going to backfire in the sense that we will see more of the same, unfortunately, right? In terms of the logic that supports the system. The logic is a financial one, is a debt-based one, and from my angle, it's an emergency-based one. So we will see more and more events that will call for emergency conditions. And
Okay.
and
Okay. So I understand where you're coming from, and I don't disagree. Um, but there is another aspect of this politically that we should raise. I just want you to address, which is that you know the way Trump and others around the world are being sold to the public is as kind of anti-system, anti-bureaucracy candidates. Um, Trump has announced that he's going to let Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk dismantle a good portion of the administrative state, the very managers of crisis that
mm,
have been in charge of emergency capitalism are seemingly on the chopping block. Um, the he just announced a few days ago, I think, maybe just on Wednesday, that Jay Bhattacharya will be the
mm,
new head of the NIH, and this is a man who was against the lockdowns.
yeah,
Um, so um, so that might be it might entail, at the very least, a restructuring of the state bureaucracies in the United States, but also there's an aim here to slim down, to not rely upon the micromanagement of society in quite the same way. It seems to be what Trump is aiming to do. There's a lot of panic amongst the credentialed class. You can see it on Twitter. Doctors are stepping forward to denounce Jay Bhattacharya, say he's underqualified, which is kind of ridiculous because he's an epidemiologist from
yeah.
Stanford. But also with a little bit more credibility, they're going after RFK, who's going to perhaps be the new head of Health and Human Services. But again, they're both um, maybe RFK less so than Jay Bhattacharya, but they're both kind of anti-systemic political figures. They're anti-system figures, meaning they're going to come in, uh, insist upon a complete reevaluation or a very deep reevaluation from the perspective of the bureaucrats in charge now. And I wonder, do you think this is an attempt, maybe a misguided one, to move away from the kind of control based political project of emergency capitalism and reinvest in a top down, Gilded Age kind of politics of the past?
So sort of, it's almost like a repeat of the sort of neoliberal free market. Forget
Hmm.
about the state. The markets do the job much better than the state. So let's let the market do the job, right?
Well,
Um,
yes and no.
it's,
It's like
it's
with tariffs. I mean, like the thing is, like, the idea of the free market, as we understand it from neoliberalism, is not really how things operated in the late 19th
oh,
and early 20th century. So it's just that the kinds of controls that are going to be imposed from the state are going to be blunter
mm,
instruments,
mm.
and um, more nationalistic, more oriented towards the nation state, and uh, whereas like the neoliberal order was sort of a way of using the New Deal Fordist model of planned economy and control in another direction towards the propping up of capital rather than the attempt to harmonize class conflict. Perhaps now this will be um, uh, that Fordist model that um, will be dismantled much more than it was under Reagan. Is what it's looking like to me. What
Mm.
what do you think of that?
Well, I think the underlying problem for the US, and I insist on this, is something that they will have to come to terms with first, sooner or later after this
Hmm.
excitement and euphoria, post-electoral euphoria, markets are exploding, and the crypto space again is Bitcoin is,
Hmm.
after all of that sort of is gone, the debt remains, right? The debt issue remains. It's a massive one. And there's one way of dealing with it, I think, and they know there is only one way, and that's to let inflation rip, to let inflation get higher, because with inflation, essentially, you get negative real rates. So essentially, you pay less on your
Hmm.
debt, and that brings down the debt bubble. So if there's one thing maybe that is going on in the background as an objective behind all the facade of
Hmm.
populist or more or less populist sort of
Hmm.
slogans, I think it's this idea of at some point, maybe as a consequence of some sort of unexpected event, right, or unexpected crisis, they don't have to play the pandemic again. They can play something else. It's very rare that they repeat the same sort of emergency. They often move from one to another very,
Hmm.
very cleverly. Well, on the back of another kind of emergency situation, then there will be the necessity to print more, to return to a sort of,
Hmm.
QE, quite substantial quantitative easing, so monetary injections that will push inflation even higher, which is beneficial. That's actually the perverse point that is beneficial to the US, right? Because it's such the debt is so massive, and the debt is not something that you can simply erase, because it's often in the hands of foreign investors, like the Chinese, the Japanese. They've got loads of that debt, and if
Hmm.
they start selling that debt, then all of a sudden the yields go up and repayments become very problematic overall. So it is a massive burden. And I think the one way in which they can tackle it, maybe the most
Hmm.
realistic way actually, is by letting inflation go up. But of course, inflation is something that they can lie about, they can manipulate more or less,
Hmm.
but it's perceived sort of physically by the people. So that would require some sort of another state of emergency scenario, I think, to justify it. We have to inject money because so and so, and that would,
Hmm.
hopefully, that would be um, sold to the people in a way that wouldn't cause um, too much noise amongst the people, as it were. But I think I see that as the main issue going ahead. I don't think real productivity in real terms can actually improve the US economy much, I have to say, on the basis of what I've just talked about, right? The fact that productivity is mostly technological and doesn't necessarily involve productive labor as it used to during the Fordist period, during the Fordist boom up until the 1970s, when that boom came to an end. I think there's a lot of nostalgia, around
Hmm.
these days. Like, we're looking back as if we can recreate the same conditions of growth, same
Hmm.
conditions the post-war period, even forgetting that those conditions came on the back of two world wars, first of all, right? Which functions as a catalyst for technological development, etc., and reconstruction, of course, but more importantly, those conditions were powered by mass productive labor, intensive productive labor, which now simply is unthinkable in the current condition, in the current capitalist conditions. It's simply unthinkable, and that's, as I
Hmm.
said, because of technological innovation, because of technological automation of production, is essentially. And you simply cannot erase those conditions, right?
Hmm.
It's immanent. It's part of. It's integral to the capitalist mode of production.
Hmm.
So I go back to the same point. I think the main target, even though it's not spoken about directly, at least, would be to find a way of reducing the debt. And when it's about protectionism, it's also protectionism in terms of managing that debt, right? Managing a debt that is without being dependent on Chinese investors or Japanese investors or UK investors, blah blah blah. Finding a way of deflating the bubble um, uh, through, but how? How do you do it when the whole economic and social reproduction of a nation is based on you, state, getting more and more indebted? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the figures are astonishing. It's 1 trillion more debt every 90 days, every 3 months, right? This is the kind of debt rate that is accumulating on the shoulders of the US states. So how do you deal with that? I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
something that sooner or later you'll have to think about. And I think whatever happens, even in geopolitical space, will be somehow related to that. But yeah, it's very interesting because you almost get the picture. If you hear Trump, you almost get the picture as if he's accepting the fact that we're moving to a multipolar world, right? He says that. He wants to make good relationship with China. He wants to make good relationship with Putin, with Russia. He wants to end the war in the Ukraine. He wants to create good conditions for American workers because he realizes that those wars and are detrimental
Mm-hmm.
to the US. He's saying it openly. Um, but what is it that he is not saying? That's my question. Why is
Mm-hmm.
he talking about that and not about what I think is coming, which is another wave of monetary injection, lower interest rates that will push inflation up. And of course, inflation is an invisible tax for the working classes, precisely those who voted him in.
Mm-hmm.
And that will need to be justified somehow. Um, so, in realist terms, to me, that seems to be the problem. So, what it says for me is important because it hides something rather than for what it is. It seems to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, so yeah, I'm curious to see what will happen next. But I have to say, looking at the macro picture, looking at liquidity in the markets, for example, which is now drying up, if you look at indicators like the reverse repo facility of the Federal Reserve, you realize that the liquidity in the US market is actually very rapidly drying up. So we're going back to September 2019 conditions, more or less, in terms of liquidity. And that liquidity is absolutely crucial for market capitalization.
Mm-hmm.
So all things considered, and including sort of Trump being both the crypto king and the perfect man for banks in terms of bringing down interest rates. When we add into this the fact that the ECB, the European Central Bank, is also now calling for lower interest rates.
Mm-hmm.
The Fed is warning about inflation going up. We know that inflation is already going up in Europe, right? The most recent
Mm-hmm.
data are already saying that inflation is rising again, despite rates and everything. So I think we are kind of moving towards a perfect storm, right? And we don't know yet where it will take place, this storm, but I think 2025 probably will deliver a storm of sorts that will then
Mm-hmm.
create certain conditions for, again, keeping the markets liquid, right? And
Well,
I'm afraid my vision is quite pessimistic when I consider all the sort of macro um, events that are taking place around
well,
us.
you know, it strikes me that
But I hope I'm
your
wrong.
no, yeah, I know. It strikes me that your vision of the situation, which I don't really disagree with, or at least I don't have a good basis to disagree with, is one which uh, supports from if you're supporting the capitalist class, if you want this kind of society to continue, and you want it to be well managed, then if everything you're saying is true, then the most conservative and sensible approach would have been the approach of the Biden administration or even the Obama administration. In other words, no sudden moves. You know, tinker around the edges, see what you can do to manage the overall trend, and when necessary, you know, create a artificial shock in order to provide cover to so that you can do massive things in the background
mm, mm,
like
mm,
COVID, right? All of
mm.
that is would be very sensible. Um, if you want to, if you're a ruler, you know, if you're one of the members of the political class that actually has to manage the crisis that is perpetuating itself. So, but if
Well,
you the what would not be sensible is to come in with the promise of really rapid uh, reindustrialization and onshoring. What would not be sensible would be to promise the end of the war in Ukraine, because the war in Ukraine is serving a function, right? It actually has a role to play here, uh, providing an opportunity to create inflation with political justification, and also even possibly destroy some capital to make reinvestment much more uh, easy, you know, to cheapen the capital that needs to be reinvested in. Um, so and you wouldn't want to give the the population the sense that there could be a return to a more straightforwardly productive economy. Um, or you know, you wouldn't want to give working people, those that remain as working people, the sense that they have the right to the dignity of their work and to be participants in society on that basis. That, which I think is what Trump has been promising. And that, along with it comes this idea that we're going to be a little bit uh, more constrained. We're not going to try to run the world. We're going to be focused on ourselves and our livelihoods and lives rather than these
You
grand
know,
schemes around the world.
but politics, you know better than me, that is theater. Most of it is just theater, right? These guys are
Mm-hmm,
puppets. Let's cut to the chase. These guys are puppets. They're manipulated from, you know, from start to end. So we should really pay attention when we hear, when we believe, you know, if even believing, um, you know, a sentence here and there of what they say, because ultimately it's about changing a narrative. So maybe the system needs a different narrative now,
mm-hmm,
right? After that narrative had grown a little bit stale with the public, etc. In order
mm-hmm,
to keep up this appearance that, wow, we are living in a democracy, right? Voting really matters. We get somebody else in who's going to do something totally different now, and we're going
mm-hmm,
to live in a new era of growth. And come on, it's going to be fantastic, and so on and so forth. I mean, so
mm-hmm.
far it's just a narrative. Remember, it's just a story that they're telling you. There's
Right.
some politician who, in fact, believe in Trump already. It's my God, it takes a lot of imagination, a lot of goodwill, right, to believe what he says. For me, at
Mm-hmm,
least,
mm-hmm.
he's certainly not a man. He's not a kind of working class man himself. I don't think he comes from there. He's a man.
No, no,
We
no.
know exactly where he comes from, right?
He's not even
So
a part of the productive capitalist
okay,
class.
so
He's a
now that
real
he's
estate guy, right? You know?
a
Yeah.
real estate guy, yes, who's indebted himself in order to make a lot of money, and
Mm-hmm,
this and massively. And now that he comes out with all these promises, it's a great narrative. It changes the focus from one stale narrative to the next. It keeps up this dream, this fantasy of a great democracy, a great liberal democracy. But at the same time, I'm absolutely certain whether Trump or Harris or Biden or anybody else, if something has to happen, it will happen, regardless of who's in power, right? If the elites, the financial elites, decide that something has to happen, um, forget forget the politicians. They're not going to stop it. Then they're not going to say no. I'm not going to let it happen. They will play ball, and they will say yes, right? On top of that, as I said, Trump is even better than Kamala, I think, or Biden, because more likely to want zero interest rates or even negative interest rates. In 2019, he hinted at let's move below zero, and he referred to central bankers as boneheads because they were not doing it. And this is wonderful if you're in Wall Street because it allows you to borrow cheaply and to drive up your speculations, your derivatives.
Right.
You keep up
Right.
your. So do you know what I mean? One thing is what he says, and what thing is what actually happens,
Hmm.
even in economic monetary terms, and they often are very contradictory. They contradict each other. Political statements. I'll wait and see if he delivers on the working class new era, or and so on and so forth. I strongly doubt it, and I'd be very happy to see it happen, or at least to see some kind of dignity brought back to the workers. I'm
Hmm.
absolutely in favor of that, and it's just a matter of what you believe in here. But I doubt that he will be able to deliver it. I think it will remain an empty promise, and I think something
Yeah.
else will happen, and all of a sudden will take the attention away from it.
I want to
Possibly.
point out. I want to point out that even if we believed that Trump was going to be able to accomplish the things that he promises to accomplish, um, it would be done in a way that would ultimately not facilitate the development of an international socialist movement, right? I mean, and
Absolutely
here's
not.
what here's why I say I want to point that out is that he is talking about dividing the working class against itself, and he's talking. I'm going to let you put your earbuds back in so you can hear
Sorry,
me.
sorry, sorry. Thank you.
That's no. He's talking about dividing the working class against itself internationally, right? So there's that aspect of it, and he is reinvigorating the nation, um, and a certain kind of nationalism, which is to facilitate that first aim. Um, and the policies of McKinley were not the policies were the policies that uh, led to the Great Depression and were created massive inequality. We look back on that era as the age of the robber baron, right? Not as a great moment for working people necessarily, but nonetheless, as a socialist in the United States, if we were to see an increase in employment and productive employment, the potential to organize workers politically might be greater than it is now. And so the hope for a socialist like myself would be, okay, we can start to return to thinking about the interests of labor, and we can start to return to the idea of workers having their own political interests apart from the interest of the state. In other words, rather than the working class interest being, we want to expand certain agencies and bureaucracies that will help us get a cut of the corporate state pie. We want to try to struggle as an independent force in society, independent of the state. And so that would be the upside to what would be, nonetheless, really a very obvious kind of capitalist and backwards looking approach to politics in a number of ways. So it's not like I want to embrace the Trump agenda exactly. It's just that I want to say, okay, if this is what's happening, where is the opportunity for the left? And one of the big opportunities I think would be to break from the old New Deal statist managerial approach to leftism that has dominated our thinking for so long, certainly since the days of the New Left. So I want to say that, and uh, so I agree with you there. But then, okay, now I'm going to just break and ask a question not related to any of that, which is since Trump has been elected, Biden has escalated the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and um, to the point where not only is Ukraine using U.S. weapons, missiles, to attack in Russia directly, and basically not only is the United States thereby attacking Russia with missiles, but um, uh, Putin and Russia has responded by launching an ICBM or an IRBM,
Yeah.
which is a missile that these missiles were designed to carry nukes.
Long
It's
range missile, yeah.
yeah, they were, and it's the first time one of these missiles has been used in combat in all of history. Um, it was not a nuclear weapon, but it could have been, and it was launched in order to remind everyone that they have the capacity to fire weapons which cannot be stopped and which can deliver a nuclear payload. So, uh, what do you make of the
Yeah.
escalation since Trump was elected?
Yeah, well, obviously, there's different kind of powers at the top that are often conflicting with each other. So you get Wall Street, you got the party of war, you got the military-industrial complex, you got deep state, and sometimes they differ in their objectives, right? Some of them might want more of this rather than more of that. And obviously, the war is a great, it helps, it brings a lot of benefits for a lot of for a few people, yes, but those who are precisely in that party of war, as it were, those who want permanent warfare. Um, and I think now what Biden has done is clearly under the influence, as it were, under the pressure of those military industrial complex people who want more war, want to escalate the war, and they want Europe to, also build a kind of warfare infrastructure. So Europe is now investing more and more, or wants to invest more and more into war bonds, for example, right? So invest more and more into the military. Um, so certainly there is that. And I do hope seriously that Trump is serious about ending the war with Ukraine. I think that would be a good news, right? Like really on at that level, it'd be really good news. But my fear after these 4 or 5 years, since the pandemic, we've seen one emergency after the other. So whenever one emergency ends, almost seamlessly, we step into another one. I remember
Mm-hmm.
the end of COVID, how it was literally the day after, it was replaced by the Putin virus, as I called it.
Mm-hmm.
So all of a sudden, Putin became public enemy number one worldwide. He already was, of course, but at that point, he became even more of an enemy. So replaced the virus as a, and so when this war in the Ukraine is over, you think about the potential escalation of the Gaza situation, right? What is Trump saying about Israel and Gaza? Is he in favor also of ending that war?
No,
I don't
no.
think
Well,
so. No. I
well,
mean,
he's in favor of winning that war, which is the
right.
same policy as Biden
But
with Russia, right?
winning that war means escalating that war, because winning that war means wiping out Palestinians from the face of the earth. And then perhaps going further, it will go further. It will escalate. It will be a domino effect in the Arab world, of course. So you create another kind of emergency. Are we betting back on Islamic terrorism? The good old weapon of Islamic terrorism, which we sort of fueled for a while, for a few years before COVID
Mm-hmm.
came. I wonder, right? Because this sort of economic context cannot function without constant states of emergency. Remember, Naomi Klein called it a shock doctrine. I think it's changed a little bit because it's really fundamentally a monetary thing, but it still remains disaster capitalism, as she called it back in the day. Um, we live in the age of emergency or disaster capitalism. The system cannot do without that constant flow of emergencies, which also serve the purpose, let's not forget, and this again goes counter the narrative that Trump is presenting. I think the controlled demolition of the real economy, rather than the kind of sort of revitalization of the work-based economy. I think it goes against it. It's ultimately a mechanism of control. Why is Trump the king of cryptos? Why is he pushing for crypto? This is another interesting question, right? Cryptos are, yes, decentralized at the moment. They're perceived as being decentralized, but are purely speculative assets. Purely speculative assets, right? There's nothing real in working class terms, real in cryptos. Yes, they might benefit the working class if they speculate, in cryptos because the price goes up, but it's purely a speculative thing. And so, how else is it going to benefit the system if not through a potential centralization of digital currencies? Right? My fear is that the current crypto space serves as a bridge towards a future digitally centralized monetary system, which is highly then controllable centrally, again, by the state. So again, what we are hearing is one thing. What I think is happening is something very different, I'm afraid.
Well, let's talk about the situation in Gaza and
Yeah,
the region. What I think might be considered now to be a regional war in the
yeah,
Middle East, right?
mm,
Um, it seemed to me that during the Biden administration, what Biden wanted to do was allow Israel to do enough damage to Hamas so that the Hamas could be brought to the table and a negotiated settlement could be arranged. That would ultimately completely marginalize Hamas as a political player, so that Gaza would be run either by Israel directly or through Saudi Arabia or some proxy for the United States and Israel both. And the whole point was to squash the Hamas as much as possible. Maybe not completely destroy them, but marginalize them and uh, to return to the vision of the Abraham Accords, um, to create a new kind of quasi stability in the region, so that United States could move out of the Middle East and focus on China, that and have its conflict shift and its military investments shift, create enough of a peace in the region so that that aim could be accomplished. And I don't, I do think that Trump has a similar aim in terms of, would Trump be willing to accept the kind of negotiated peace agreement that Hamas was, but not Israel, was willing to accept during the Biden administration? I think so. As long as it didn't, the real key or problem would be after that was negotiated, which would be kind of a temporary peace. How would um, Gaza be managed during the rebuilding of the region? Who would be really in charge? How would political authority be divvied up um, under conditions of what we're going to call peace, right? And so it seems to me that that is the aim of the United States, and that the conflict that kept that from being accomplished was not really between the United States and Hamas, or the United States and the Palestinians, but between the United States and Israel. That Israel would not play ball, would not go along with the U.S., and the U.S. had very little leverage, and through that process. And the question will be for the Trump administration: can Trump gain more leverage over Israel through an approach that seems to be, just a full-on embrace, rather than the kind of Blinken approach of trying to be like the adult in the room, moderate the conflict? What do you make of all of that?
Well, I always see this sort of Middle East situation as being one that can be used again as an escalation. You've got Iran, you've got Lebanon, the Hezbollah. because Israel is not just about Gaza now; it's also about Iran and the Hezbollah, right? So the
Mhm.
situation can be escalated into a Middle East crisis, and a Middle East crisis would be a perfect justification to again to the kind of policies that somebody like Trump administration would be able to execute, right? And that would benefit once again Wall Street rather than Main Street, because all of a
Mhm.
sudden you could have problems with supply chains. You would have the problem with inflation because oil prices would go up. So I see perhaps in a more Machiavellian way, as a sort of potential way of disrupting global trade, monetary flows, and so on and so forth, which is precisely what I call controlled demolition of the system as we have it. That would allow for certain monetary policy under duress, under situation of international constraint, international duress, that people have to accept because, my God, there's a war raging over there, and as a consequence of that war, we have to face the difficult reality of bottlenecks in supply chains, and therefore we have to accept a
Mhm.
chain of things that perhaps include even rationing of goods, price
Mhm.
controls, and more centralization. Like I see this happening into this for me is the future of capitalism today. A kind of they call about neo-feudal. There's a lot of talk
Mhm.
about this neo-feudal society. I think we're moving into a more and more authoritarian, centralized system, despite the fact that our leaders like Trump are telling us the opposite. That they're selling us a different dream. They're selling us again the American dream, the old American dream in many ways, right? In many
Mhm.
ways. I don't think that's possible. I think this is just a ruse. This is a way of deceiving us. Look here, don't look there. Invest some of your fantasies and enjoyment in this dream, in this nostalgia, and so that you don't understand what is really going on. I think these wars will be, unfortunately, fueled more and more. There will be some periods of potential, illusionary ceasefire, but then they will be restarted somehow because they are used by the system to, again, to create money out of nowhere, first of all, justified precisely because in Europe they're doing it already. In Europe they're talking about military bonds, huge amount of debt being created precisely for that purpose, right?
Mhm.
To prop up the military system because of Putin, because Putin is about to invade, apparently. I mean, they've been using this rhetoric again and again. So I really believe that we are, unfortunately, in an age of forever wars. They call it forever wars. I think it's going to be a constant we will have constant reminders that war is not going away. The threat of war, even the threat of war works. The threat of
Mhm.
escalation, the threat of nuclear escalation, it works precisely to keep people in fear and to create the right conditions for a certain type of economic model to be perpetrated further.
Mhm.
So again, I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that you're right and I'm wrong. I want to share some of your optimism about peace, about production, about work, about working class, and economic condition going forward. But when I look at the whole picture, right? In historical terms, how capital has changed, has transformed itself, as the reasons why it has transformed itself. I, I seem to understand that simply it's impossible to go back to the old conditions, right? And
Mhm.
that wars have a different purpose today to perhaps what they had before. Um, Modern wars are always a means of credit creation. We know that, whether it's the First, Second World War. But now they really have, I think, a purpose in terms of also pushing us slowly but surely towards a more centralized control system, which will also, at some point, I think, involve um, phasing out liberal democracy, phasing out the idea of a globally connected economy where commodities just move from one side of the planet to the other, because that is no longer working either. So I think a system of control is coming, a system of not just surveillance, but control, physical control of people, physical control of goods. Price controls probably, which could be a good thing in itself if it wasn't part of the capitalist system, right? Doesn't work like that. So that's
Yeah.
the way I see it. I'm afraid, but I hope I'm wrong, and I hope you're both right about Trump wanting to end the Ukrainian war. I mean, that would be already in itself a great thing, for the Ukrainians in the first instance, but also for Europeans, and for Americans, and
Mm.
for Russians too. So I really hope that it's happening. It's going to happen. That would be a massive thing.